Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the SHAPS valuation results. Why are we talking about this morning? Well, the SHAPS valuation results came out a month or so ago, and slightly counterintuitively, deficit has gone up, but future service costs have come down. So lots to understand, some options to work through, and a timeline to be aware of. I'm Alistair Russell-Smith, and I'm chairing the webinar this morning. I lead the charity and not-for-profit sector pensions practice at Spence and Partners. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Sean Campbell, who works with me in the practice, and we'll be running through some of the valuation results. And also very pleased to be welcomed by James Keith. James is a pensions partner at Morton Fraser McRoberts and works with quite a few Scottish RSLs and more broadly charities and third sector clients on pensions and broader issues. Let me just share my screen and we can then get going. Right. So we've got about 30 minutes of content that we're going to go through this morning with you both, with all of you. So Sean's going to start by giving you a recap on pension provision in the sector and the SHAPS valuation results. I will then run through the impact of those results on deficit recovery contributions, expenses, and future accrual, and also another option to think about if you're also in the LGPS. James will then run us through some consultation and contractual considerations, and then we'll finish with some implementation timescales. Be delighted to answer any questions you might have as we go along. You should be able to see a Q&A button at the bottom of your ribbon. You might need to click on the More button if you can't see it automatically. But just click on that and ask away, fire away any questions you'd like, and we'll pick those up. Fear not, those questions just come in to the presenters, so you can ask what you like. No sort of concern about any other participants seeing that. So let's get going. Sean, can you run us through pension provision in the sector, please?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. So, good morning, everyone. I'll start by setting the scene with a general overview of pension provision across the sector. So, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, there are two main types of pension arrangements commonly offered. So, defined benefit (DB) and defined contribution (DC). So, defined benefit, as the name suggests, the retirement benefits are predefined based on a formula which typically take into account your salary and length of service. So this type of scheme offers more certainty in retirement, but can be more expensive for employers to maintain. Defined contribution, in this arrangement, each individual has their own pension pot. Both the employee and employer contribute a fixed percentage of salary into this pot, which is then invested. The value of the pot at retirement will depend on the level of contributions and investment performance. So within the housing sector, the two main DB providers are local government pension schemes such as Strathclyde or Lothian Pension Fund, and also the Scottish Housing Association pension scheme, SHAPS, which is our main focus today. So SHAPS includes both DC, DB and DC sections, although we also see employers using commercial DC providers in some cases too. So it's worth noting that DB arrangements are generally closed to new members, and we're seeing a shift towards DC as the default option for new hires. So it's something that I'll touch on further in the next slide. So this slide visualizes the trend I just mentioned and how contributions have shifted over time. So the two categories on the left-hand side, final salary and average earnings, represent DB schemes. So you'll notice that contributions to these have steadily declined year on year. In contrast, DC contributions have been significantly higher, although there has been a slight decrease in the last couple of years, but it's clear to see DC is the main provision in the sector. At the bottom of the slide, we've highlighted that while around 70 RSLs still have some form of DB provision, most of these are now through LGPS rather than SHAPS. So as for DC arrangements, we've highlighted what we typically see being offered across the sector. So employer contributions usually range between 5 and 10% of salary, The most generous we've seen is 12% from the employer. A common design is two times matching. So for example, if an employee contributes 5%, the employer will contribute 10. This is usually capped around the 10% level. So even if an employee contributes more than 5% of salary, the employer contribution doesn't increase further. Another trend we've seen is when employers transition staff out of DB schemes, they may offer a more generous DC contribution for a limited period, say 3 to 5 years, to support the transition and gain employee approval. After that, the contribution levels usually align with the standard offering then. So if you can jump on the slide again, please, Alistair. So now focusing more specifically on SHAPS. As mentioned earlier, SHAPS includes both DB and DC sections under the same trust. A unique feature of SHAPS DB section is it's a last man standing structure. So this means that all current employers in the scheme collectively underwrite the liabilities of any exiting employers. So in theory, if you were the last remaining employer, you could be underwriting an over £750 million liability scheme. One advantage of the SHAPS DC section is that it enables employers to close DB accrual without triggering an immediate Section 75 exit debt. That debt is only due when the last member leaves either DB or DC section of the scheme. So then some key statistics as of March 24 at the valuation. So around 130 employers still have DB liabilities in SHAPS. Only 27 of those are still offering future accrual in the DB section. There are around 450 active members in the DB section compared to 8,000 deferred and pensioner members. The pie chart on screen shows the breakdown of where the active members are currently accruing benefits. So the largest proportion, as you can see, is in the care radius section, then followed by the final salary. So as we've shown, there's been a steady flow of members from DB provision into DC, and this is largely due to increasing DB costs. However, as we'll come on to in a moment, the 2024 valuation has actually led to a reduction in the DB costs for the first time in a number of years. So let's now look briefly at the 2024 SHAPS valuation, which many of you will likely have seen already. So the key headline, the ongoing funding level has fallen from 98% in 2021 to 90% in 2024. As a result, deficit contributions will be recommencing from April 2026. TPT have pointed out that the deterioration in funding level is largely due to poor asset performance, especially around the time of the mini budget in September 2022. On the flip side, the Section 75 funding level has actually improved slightly from 70% to 75%, likely helped by the rise in interest rates. We've also seen a significant drop in the scheme liabilities, so from about 1.2 billion in 2021 down to around 770 million in 2024, again, largely due to movements in interest rates. The positive takeaway from this valuation is a reduction in future service contribution rates. So it's a welcome development for the 27 employers still offering DB accrual. So the table on the right-hand side there shows the significant fall in future service contribution rates across all DB sections of SHAPS. So that's a very general overview of pensions in the sector broadly, as well as a closer look at SHAPS. I'll now hand back to Alistair, who will take you through what this means in practical terms and the options available to employers following the 2024 valuation.
Great, thank you, Sean. So yeah, let's start thinking about now what do those results mean for your costs. So first costs we're looking at on this slide are deficit contributions and expenses. So as Sean mentioned, deficit contributions are recommencing from April 2026 onwards. So that's the blue bars you can see on the chart there. So they are payable until 31st of March 2030. They're starting at about 16 million a year, going up at 3% a year across all employers and SHAPS. And generally speaking, these are coming back at a level that's about 50% of the level you were paying before deficit contributions stopped in 2022. Now, one thing to be aware of in relation to these contributions is that it may be necessary to pay them for a further 2 years, which are the lighter blue bars on the chart. And that is dependent on the outcome of the TPT court case that you may be aware of. So this is a court case that affects most of the schemes in TPT, not just SHAPS, and it is looking at whether a series of historic benefit changes were legally effective or not. If the conclusion of that court case is that they were not legally effective, then members' pensions are going to have to be increased a bit, and that's going to increase the liabilities by about 3% in SHAPS and require those deficit contributions to be payable for a further 2 years. In terms of what you can do about all of these costs, I mean, I guess not a great deal. These are payable, so what you need to think about instead is, well, this is an unbudgeted cost and an expense. So what do we do about that? What else has to give to fund these? Do we need to initiate a broader pensions review to afford these deficit contributions recommencing? One thing you can do, as noted on the slide, is opt to pay the deficit contributions up front, which attracts a 6.2% discount. We'd probably caution against paying too much of it up front, or certainly if you are considering that, make sure you understand what that means in terms of getting those contributions back, or do other employers benefit from you paying those contributions in advance if they were to exit, for example. So definitely worth getting some clear answers from TPT on issues like that if you're considering paying them in advance. The second costs that we then consider on this slide is expenses, so administration expenses, and there's a few points to note in relation to these. So these are the sort of purpley bars at the bottom. I mean, the first thing is you're paying a share of expenses at the moment, and expenses have increased. So the expense loading from April 2026 onwards is going up by about 40%, and your expense contribution is now roughly going to be about 10% of your deficit contribution. And these contributions are also payable beyond 2032. So you will have to keep paying these expenses potentially until something called significant maturity is reached. And if there's enough money in the scheme at that point, it may be that scheme assets can be used to start funding expenses. There is an expense reserve that has been built into this valuation to fund expenses at that later point in time. And the last thing to note on expenses is that the employer committee is considering some alternative ways to allocate expenses. So at the moment, expenses are prorated by your liability share. So employers with larger liabilities pay a larger proportion of the expenses. How might they change this? Well, I suppose one thing we can look at is SHIPS, so the equivalent scheme in England and Wales, and they have adjusted the way they allocate expenses, and they now include a part of the allocation is a fixed cost per employer or per member. So recognizing that some of the expenses are fixed rather than variable. So if we see that come through in SHAPS, what we might see is a larger proportion of expenses being funded by the smaller employers. So keep aware of developments in this area and the impact that will have on your costs. Second thing to think about is future accrual. So like Sean said, good news here in that the future service contribution rates are coming down from April 2026 onwards. And I think the first thing you need to think about as an employer in the scheme is, well, are we going to keep DB open to future accrual or not? If you are to keep it open, we're on the left-hand side of the slide here. And one of the things you'll have to think about and make a decision about by the 30th of January next year is how to share that saving on the future service costs between the employer and employees. So we've looked at an example on this on the slide here on the left-hand side. So an employer that's in the 80th care section. So that's the most common section for future accrual now. Total contribution rate required for that at the moment is 24% of salaries, and that is dropping to 14% of salaries from April next year. Now, how that's split between the employer and the employee at the moment will obviously vary. We've assumed in this example that it's been shared evenly, so both the employer and the employee are paying 12% currently. So what options might you have? Well, probably a starting point for a lot of employers, given that the employer is having to fund the recommencement of deficit contributions, which in most cases is bigger than any future service savings, is that the employer keeps 100% of the savings. So that's the next column on the table here. The employer rate going from 12% to 2%, whilst the employee keeps paying 12%. One other option that we're discussing with few employers in SHAPS is more of a sort of sharing of the cost savings, which is the next column along. Why might you do that? I guess the main reason you might do that is if you've been asking your employees to pay more historically as costs have gone up, you might feel you want to share some of the savings with them as costs are coming down. And then the last column is you could potentially give all the savings to the employees and the employer keep paying the same rate. I guess whilst that's sort of technically possible, it's not something we're seeing many employers considering. So that's what you need to think about if you're keeping DB open, and we'll just come on to the timelines for that as well later on. If you're considering closing DB to future accrual, well, why might you be doing that? Well, I guess the first thing to note is the historic reason for closing to accrual has gone away, because historically the main reason to close to accrual is to reduce cash costs as future service contribution rates kept going up. But we're now in a scenario where future service contribution rates are coming down. So if anything, closing DB to future accrual might actually increase your short-term cash costs, because it may well be that the replacement pension arrangement you put in place for your employees has a higher employer contribution rate than SHAPS DB. But despite that, some employers are still thinking about closing to future accrual. And you can see some of the reasons on the right-hand side for why that is. And this is more of a risk-based decision. So, I mean, we've got two sort of good examples that we've already talked about. We've had the recommencement of deficit contributions, and we've got the court case and potential extra liabilities in relation to that. So those are sort of two pretty good examples of the sort of unknown costs and risks that can come through from DB. And so it might be that despite the short-term cash costs coming down, you're still concerned about the broader liability and risk associated with DB, and turning off DB to future accrual is a way to reduce the impact of that. As the funding improves in SHAPS, we might see more employers exiting potentially. We may see more orphan liabilities growing, and your share of those orphan liabilities, your share of the deficit, will keep growing if you keep allowing future accrual in the scheme. So that can be another reason to think about it. And like Sean touched on at the start, just sort of looking at the sector trends, there is a big trend from DB to DC historically, and it may be you want to align your pension offering with what you're seeing in the sector more broadly. On the bottom bullet there, one thing to think about if you are thinking about closing to accrual that we're talking to a few employers about is you might decide to offer to keep paying your employees in DB a higher contribution rate than what you would pay if they were to stay in DB. So looking at that example on the left-hand side, the employer's paying 12%. It might be that you say, well, look, if we were to keep DB open, we'd have to keep all of those savings to fund the future accruals, so that the rate be down to 2%. Um, but we're actually going to propose to close the accrual, and we're willing to keep paying that 12% for a period of time, perhaps 3 years, before trending down to the rate that your other employees get. So one way to sort of help with a closure message if that is something you are thinking about. So those are the key points on future accrual. One last option we wanted to bring to your attention, particularly if you are in LGPS 2. So not all RSLs are in both LGPS and SHAPS, but a reasonable number are. And there's a very different funding picture in LGPS that you may be aware of. The LGPS pension schemes are currently very well funded and generally in surplus positions. So we've used an example on the left-hand side here that you can see, just sort of starting on the right-hand side of that. This RSL's got a 2 million surplus in LGPS on a cessation basis, whereas in SHAPS, it's looking at a deficit in SHAPS of 0.8 million on an ongoing basis and 2 million on a Section 75 exit basis. So this employer might be looking at this scenario and thinking, well, wouldn't it be great if we could access that LGPS surplus to help us fund some of those SHAPS deficit contributions? So this is something that we're also discussing with some RSLs at the moment. And the key thing to access that surplus is you do need to remove your remaining employees from LGPS and put them into an alternative pension arrangement to trigger that LGPS exit and potentially access that exit credit. So looking at the right-hand side of the screen here, what sort of replacement pension might you be offering your LGPS employees, bearing in mind you're also in SHAPS? Well, I guess historically you'd probably be thinking about SHAPS DC, probably with salary sacrifice as well, which obviously isn't available in LGPS. And you'd probably be offering enhanced DC terms there as well to compensate people for the loss of LGPS, and you'd be looking to get sort of all of your workforce onto a DC pension arrangement and harmonized pension arrangements across your workforce. And that can still make sense in some cases. But one thing to sort of draw to your attention that is potentially quite interesting for some employers is you might actually think about putting your LGPS employees into SHAPS DB. And one thing, if you sort of look into this in a little bit more detail, is that so SHAPS DB, the pension is not as generous as LGPS. The most generous accrual rate you can get in SHAPS is 60ths, whereas in LGPS it's 49ths. But in LGPS, the employee has to pay a contribution for this pension, at least 6%, rising up to quite a lot more than that. So one thing you might think about is moving those employees into, say, the 60th section of SHAPS with no employee contribution. And actually, if you do that, you're looking at a pension from an employee perspective that is broadly neutral in value terms as the LGPS pension that you're asking them to come out of. So an interesting thing to think about there, if you are, if you're concerned about employee relations being a sort of block to accessing an LGPS exit credit, then that's quite a neat solution to get through that and potentially access an exit credit to help you fund the SHAPS deficit contributions. But clearly, with that change and with the other benefit changes we've been talking about, you need to consult potentially, and you need to be aware of the contractual implications. So, James, can you talk us through some of the key points there, please?
Thanks, Alistair, and hello there. Yes, I think the first thing to look at is the size of your organisation. For example, if you've got more than 50 employees and you're looking to potentially make any changes in relation to pension provision, for example, increasing member contribution rates, or for example, closing the scheme to future accrual, or actually changing the level of accrual, for example, from a 60th to an 80th, then you'd be required under the pension legislation to consult with your employees. And on the left-hand side of the slide, there's a number of listed changes which you as the employer would have to think about. Now, in the immediacy of the challenges facing RSLs just now, I think it really is a case of, are you deciding to, in effect, closing scheme to future growth? I think that's probably the big one to look at in terms of any consultation. Other things can also follow from that, but I think that'd be the big one to look at. And if you were going to make that proposal, then you would be required, assuming you get more than 50 employees, to consult for at least 60 days to all affected members. And that's active and any prospective members. So, for example, if you still have it open to members who haven't, or employees who haven't actually signed up. We shouldn't forget about who you need to consult with. That would be, for example, the trade unions, if there are in fact you've got collective bargaining, or the specific employees who are appointed to represent the employees, we'd have to look at that as well. And they would have to be involved in the consultation process. And a failure to actually consult with your workforce would then potentially lead to a fine of up to £50,000 from the pension regulator. Now, it's very clear to say this isn't for LGPS and public sector pension membership, because that's not covered by the legislation. But there are also wider things to think about as well. As part of any exercise, you'd want to check the employment contracts which are in place. So if, for example, there's provision within the employee's contracts of employment that said you're entitled to a 60th or an 80th accrual in SHAPS, then that would require to be varied and amended as part of any consultation process, because whilst you could consult, but if there's actually a contractual entitlement, that would take precedent over any employer obligation to consult. Now, if that's the case, then you would have to look at wider employment law consultation provisions. As Alistair said in his last slide, or slide before that, the employer also has to consult in good faith. What is the rationale behind making the change, the proposal? Because there's significant case law which has come up about pension changes. If the employer isn't telling the truth, isn't actually giving the full information and informed position to the employees, then that can in fact make it procedurally deficient. And the employees can say, well, actually, you've breached my contract of employment, and I'm going to try and resign and claim constructive dismissal. Now, that in itself can cause reputational issues for an RSL, and also lengthy legal processes, which I'm sure that RSLs do not want to look at in this kind of environment. And the last point is really about, well, what if you can't get agreement to these changes with the employees? Under current employment law, there is, in effect, a doomsday scenario, and it's called fire and rehire. Now, this can potentially be used in cessation of accrual situations whereby, after the appropriate notice is given to the employees, their contract, the proposal from the employer would be that we will dismiss you and re-engage you on every term but for your pension provision. Now, this isn't an option that any employer would take lightly, and indeed, I would recommend it's only looked at as a last resort. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is reputation, exposure to potential to the media. Also, if you've got any Scottish Government grant funding, Scottish Government looks at fair work first rights provisions, so that as part of any review of a contract, they can have regard to whether or not you follow fair employment practices. And indeed, in terms of the UK government, there are proposals to abolish the right to fire and rehire from October 2026 as part of the Employment Rights Bill, which is going through Parliament just now. So I would say that if you are looking to try and change any pension provision, you do it in collaboration, and you set a good plan about that. And that will probably move us on to probably the next slide, Alistair.
Great. Thank you, James. So yeah, we wanted to just finish up on some implementation timescales for you, which we've set out on this slide here. So we're thinking firstly at the top here about if you're making any change, if you still got DB open to future accrual in SHAPS, and you're needing to think about um, as a minimum changing the future service contributions and how you set those, but potentially also closing to accrual. What sort of process do you need to go through? We've set that out at the top of this slide. So sort of working back from the end, TPT are requesting that you inform them of the contribution rates, the employer and employee, that will be paid from April 26 onwards by the 30th of January 2026. So working back from that, you need to be thinking really this month about how do we want to set those contribution rates. So if we're retaining DB accrual, how do we split that rate between employer and employee? If you're considering closing to accrual, what is that replacement pension provision that you're going to propose to the employees? So get that bit of work done, say really this month. Then draft employee communications. Now, depending on the extent of that change, that might be a full consultation or it might be a lighter touch sort of notification. We've built into this timeline here a full consultation process. So you may well start with a letter, an FAQ, potentially employee presentations. If you're closing to accrual, you might consider providing employees with access to an IFA. So run all of that process. You're looking at potentially around 2 months for that. And it's then only after you've run that process, and like James said, you've run that fair consultation process, that you then make some final decisions the back of that consultation and feedback you've received, and make that decision before the 30th of January, obviously, so that you can then tell TPT what those contribution rates will be from April, leaving you with a couple of months to sort of just issue confirmatory communications to employees. If you also want to look at the LGPS exit credit potential that we were just talking about on an earlier slide, it's broadly a similar process, but we do think you need to do some more work up front, which is why we've got that feasibility assessment and engagement with the fund as the initial pieces of work to do on that. So think about things like, as well as what the replacement pension offer might be, is there a guarantor? The funds have a discretion on awarding an exit credit now in Scotland, so how will they operate that discretion? But assuming you've got through that and you're sort of clear on that, then into a pretty similar process. So drafting the employee communications, running a consultation process, like James mentioned. You don't have to run a pensions consultation here because it's a public sector pension scheme, but you may well be running one for contractual reasons and just good practice and governance as well. So run that process, and then again, listen to feedback, potentially refine the offers and make final decisions, and then look to issue confirmatory communications, probably February time next year, implement, and you're potentially in the position where you could get an exit credit payment in March 2026, just ahead of the SHAPS deficit contributions commencing. So that is all of the information that we wanted to run through with you. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and dive into the Q&A, and let's pick up some of these. Just whilst I'm digesting these. James, a first one for you, and we touched on this a little bit, but yeah, if you're an employer with so we've got one here they've got less than 50 employees, so they're not having to consult legally, but what would you recommend in terms of best practice for engaging with employees in that scenario if you're looking at closing DB?
An interesting question, Alistair, and there's no perfect answer to this one. However, I think for meaningful consultation, you have to give the employees enough time to think about the proposal and what that's going to mean in practice for them. So if you can't really just impose a change or try and say we're going to change your contract or whatever within, say, a week. I think realistically, you're looking at least a month. 4 weeks to a month would be a reasonable period of consultation where there's no statutory requirement to do so. And that's also assuming that there isn't, in effect, a hardwired contract provision in the contracts of employment, which then would mean that if you can't get agreement from the employees, that you might have to go down a more formal route there. But certainly, the clients that I've advised, I've always suggested at least 4 weeks plus on any consultation for pension changes.
Okay. And Sean, one for you, a question here, asking about what have we seen RSLs typically offering for DC when they're closing SHAPS DB to future accrual?
Yeah, sure. So I think you touched on this briefly in one of your slides, Alistair. So a fairly kind of typical example of what we've seen offered is a continuation of the current future service rate that's being paid into the SHAPS DB. So I think if we take the current future service rate from the tier 80s, which I think was 24%, so employees could pay 5%, say, if that's kind of what the standard DC offering is, and the employer would then pay the remaining 19%. So as we've touched on, this could be for a fixed period of, say, 3 to 5 years before it then harmonizes with the standard DC offering, or it could be that the employer contribution could gradually reduce from that 19% year on year until it's again in line with the kind of standard DC offering that all other staff are receiving. So that's a kind of fairly standard offering, but we have seen quite a broad range in this, and a lot of it kind of depends on what comes out in the consultation process, the feedback that comes back from staff, and then kind of factor that in as well to what you ultimately end up paying.
Yeah, okay. And so a couple of kind of linked questions here. So some organizations have a ring fence position in SHIPS to reduce the last man standing risk. Is this possible in SHAPS? And are we seeing organizations come out of SHAPS and setting up own trustee and administrator arrangements? Perhaps I'll comment on that first, and then James, some thoughts from you would be interesting too. I mean, we haven't seen employers coming out of SHAPS much yet. We do think it might happen in the future, and one of the reasons for that is the experience in SHIPS. So in SHIPS in England and Wales, there have been now quite a lot of bulk transfers out of SHIPS. So that's where housing associations are transferring their share of the assets and liabilities out of SHIPS into their own pension arrangement. That can either be within TPT as a standalone section, or it can be to a entirely new pension trust, and we've seen both happening. So we might see that starting to happen in SHAPS. I think the difference with SHAPS is there are a smaller number of large employers in SHAPS, and because of some of the costs and governance of running your own DB arrangement, this typically makes sense for larger employers. So we might see some larger employers do it, but probably it's not going to be something we'll be seeing the smaller employers in SHAPS doing.
Yeah.
James, anything to add on that?
I think with any multi-employer DB scheme, one of the things which the trustee has to look at is employer covenant strength. And as you mentioned, if you've got one of the larger employers in effect trying to transfer out or trying to leave, that can materially impact on the viability and the contribution rates of the scheme for the smaller employers. And they actually disproportionately then pay more expenses, more running costs So there isn't a perfect answer to this one. I don't think, Alistair. Certainly, with the uncertainty of the court case just now, you wouldn't get a discharge anyway from SHAPS. All they would do is they would estimate the Section 75 debt liability, but you won't get a discharge until the court case is cleared as well. So again, there's a lot of other wider things which I think that TPT are doing in particular about this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, actually, I mean, you raised a good point on the covenant there, because one of the issues for larger employers that are looking at a bulk transfer is actually they may get a haircut applied to their share of the assets when they bulk transfer, which is TPT effectively looking for compensation for releasing their covenant from SHAPS. So you do need to do a cost benefit analysis on that as an employer and make sure that that reduction in asset value that you suffer is worth being released from the last man standing risk. Okay, James, another question for you. Why are the employers liable for the additional 2 years deficit payments if the court case goes the wrong way, I guess, and crystallizes those extra liabilities? Why aren't we pursuing whoever gave us this incorrect advice through professional indemnity insurance?
It's a tough question. Right. Trustees have an obligation under trust law to apply the benefits as they are, as the trustee in real estate. They have employed Magic Circle lawyers who have reviewed the documentation, and they've also got senior counsel opinion in terms of how to apply certain rules and provisions within the pension scheme. However, they're not certain about that, so they are going to court to try and get a declaration that it has been applied correctly. Now, the risk of a court case is sometimes a judge doesn't agree with what you put forward in your evidence, particularly if there's representative beneficiaries in England and other positions put forward. I do love it though that it's always the lawyer's fault, because effectively that's what the question's trying to imply, that there was a drafting error, and there might have been, and there might be a position in terms of whereby prescription or or limitation hasn't expired, and potentially there is legal action against the advisor in question. I don't know. But again, professional negligence is a very difficult thing to establish, and it would have to be beyond doubt. You know, for example, the court case would have to have occurred. They'd have to say, well, there's a liability there that's crystallised in the first place, and then there has to be a loss that stems from that. And I don't think that the scheme's there yet, because the court case is ongoing. So there might not be the liability. So, but it's a perfectly legitimate question for you to ask if the court case comes back, and ask what have the trustees done to try and mitigate their loss. Have they in effect entered into what's a standstill agreement, whereby they said, we think there's a potential claim here and we're not going to take action, but we're putting you on notice. I don't know whether that's taken place yet or not. So, but it's a very interesting question, and hopefully the court case will not increase the liabilities by the 3%, which Alistair mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and we should be finding the outcome of this out, I think, the next month or so is the court timetable, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, I'm conscious of time, but let's just take one last question, and then we'll call it a day. So, question here around trivial commutation. Is there any merit in consulting with deferred DB members in SHAPS who may have small DB pots to reduce scheme numbers and admin costs and limit future risk? I would say there is potentially merit in looking at that. I have certainly helped other employers in different TPT schemes run what are called trivial commutation exercises. So this is where you have if you have a small small pension worth less than £10,000 a year, it can be in effect cashed out, and that can take place for pensioners in receipt of their pension as well as deferred members. So it's worth looking at, and particularly, you as employers will know your profile of your former employees reasonably well, and it may well be the case that you had some employees with relatively small pensions, short service, part-time potentially, that might be eligible for that sugar accommodation, and it does just help chip away at the problem. I would sort of caution it's not a sort of magic bullet that dramatically changes the numbers. I wouldn't expect to see a very dramatic reduction in exit debts as a result of it, but it certainly helps sort of chip away and keep the problem as small as possible. James, any sort of closing thoughts from you on trivial commutation or any other points?
I think it has to be for the right reasons.
Yeah.
If it's a genuine de-risking proposal and strategy, that's fair enough. But if you bear in mind that, remember those small DB pots, will they respond to you? Will they actually engage with you? Do they really know they've got their pension benefits there? There's lots of things which could slow up a process. It's one of these ones I never say never. But I think it's one of the nice to haves rather than I think the priority for RSLs going forward.
Yeah. Good. Okay. We will leave it there. Just a reminder, the sort of key points. We've got the SHAPS valuation results out. There's that 30th of January deadline for anyone open to future accrual. And you need to start thinking about how you're going to budget for those deficit contributions. And in some cases, we're seeing RSLs initiate a broader review of pensions to see how they can afford those deficit contributions. But it's been great chatting that through and discussing the thorny issues and topics with Sean and James. So thank you to both of you. We will be sending a recording out of this webinar to you afterwards, so please do feel free to share it with any colleagues or anyone else that you think might find it useful. And of course, please do get in touch with us if you have any questions or would like to discuss your specific circumstances in more detail. I'm conscious we didn't get through all the questions, so we will also take a look at those and pick those up after the webinar where we can. But we'll leave it there for now. Thanks to James and to Sean, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.